Welcome to Un Café con Scala, which means a coffee with Scala. Have a coffee with us while we chat with experts from the educational, technological, and academic field about virtual and online education, trends, news, events, and more. Brought to you by Scala Learning. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Scala Learning's podcast, Un Café con Scala. As you may have noticed already, this episode will be conducted 100% in English, marking our first of many episodes for our English-speaking community. So in today's episode, we'll be speaking with Lucian Alexandrin about learner autonomy in virtual programs. Hi, Luke, how are you? Welcome. Thank you for being here.
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I think if I can introduce myself just really briefly as well. So I am a psychologist. I have worked mainly in education for the past 10, 15 years, working in foreign language teaching, working on large scale projects that have to do with higher education. And more recently, I am a business development manager for Scala Learning, where we support universities with their ambitions for growth.
Amazing. Thank you, Luke. So let's get straight to our topic today, learner autonomy. Could you please explain that with your own words for the people who don't know much or anything about the topic?
Of course, yeah. Learner autonomy, I think, is a very key and basic topic. It has to do with the ability that we all have as learners to continue learning beyond a formal setting, beyond the classroom, beyond university, beyond any kind of training or sort of teaching experience. This is learner autonomy, our ability to function and continue learning.
Amazing. So this learner autonomy, this process, as you may call it, do you have any key concepts for it, or any way that you can maybe part it in different sections, or is it like a process that a person follows, or is it more like a like something maybe the university or the teacher tries to build around the students? How does it work?
Of course. I mean, to a certain degree, we are all autonomous learners. We're independent learners. We have to do it. We don't always have access to a formal learning setting. So we tend to sort of try to improve our lives and our learning by working by ourselves, right? So, but if we think of learner autonomy as a, let's say, as a concept to do with learning and with teaching that is associated with a more formal learning or teaching, then yes, there are a few sort of basic concepts that we would like to clarify before we start explaining how this develops and how it can actually get better in everyone's life. So there are three concepts that I'd like to discuss today as an introduction, as it were, to learner autonomy. And they are the concept of affordances, the concept of scaffolding, and the concept of metacognition. So affordances or affordance is the property of a object or a system or a process that allows us to interact with it. So to take a very basic example, a glass door that allows us to sort of enter a store or enter any kind of a building has the affordance of allowing us to actually pass through the threshold, pass through the door, be able to access something on the inside. But at the same time, because it's made of glass, it also allows us to see inside. It might have maybe a handle or just a way of opening that might be a swinging door. It might be just a sliding door. And so the affordance of the door is to allow us to enter a premise, and also it allows us, if it's transparent, if it's made of glass, to see inside. So that's the concept of affordances.
Like the benefits you could get out of something, or how it serves you?
Exactly. How that's a very good way of putting it. It's how does it serve us, sort of as we interact with it? What sort of progress it allows us to make in our daily routine, daily life, daily interactions, right? So in learning, we do discuss this concept quite a bit. essentially, especially for autonomous learning, where we depend on technology, we depend on different systems, we depend on different processes. It is important for us to identify the affordances of the technology we have at our disposal, as a way for us to be able to maximize the interaction that we have with it and the benefits that we get from it. So affordances is very important for autonomous learning, and we'll go into a few examples and details later. The second concept that is very important to learning is the concept of scaffolding. So scaffolding, in an everyday sense, is the structure we erect around a building under construction that allows the workers to get up, that allows for materials to get up there, that maybe offers some kind of support to this building being erected. So scaffolding is very important in our physical world, but also for learning. Ideally, learning doesn't happen just by itself, but we have different structures, different processes, a different way of sort of supporting our learning, and we call this scaffolding in learner autonomy. And this is very important to all teachers and instructors everywhere, which is why we also have to think about it and to see how we can make it work, how we can set it in place, and make it available for learners beyond or outside the classroom setting when there's no teacher present or no instructor, no support, no guidance. Ideally, we have the scaffolding in place to support learners. And the third concept that I wanted to discuss as well is the concept of metacognition. Metacognition, you can think of it as our ability to think about our own thinking, to sort of be able to assess, evaluate, interpret, just essentially think as a parallel line to how our brain and our mind works. And this is very important. We obviously do it all the time when we reflect upon an experience. We might have had an emotion as we interact with someone, or it might be that we're reading a book or watching something on television, and then we reflect on our own thinking. And this is, of course, a normal part of our lives. But it is also a very important part of our learning, because as we strive to learn something independently, autonomously, again, outside of this classroom or formal learning setting, it is important for us to be able to reflect on our own learning, for us to be critical assessors of what the progress that we've made, and for us to be able to congratulate ourselves, to be very positive, or on the contrary, to be just a bit more, critical in the sense of structuring our learning experience. So these three concepts, affordances, scaffolding, and metacognition, are very important. And as we discuss learner autonomy today, I'd like to briefly touch on each of them and sort of see how important they might be, and how instructional designers, teachers, universities, any kind of a learning system that aims to support learners as they learn autonomously need to take these three concepts into consideration and to really find a practical way to have them applied for their learners' benefits.
All right, so far we have learner autonomy as a process or a way or a solution maybe that a student or any person could just not just learn by themselves, but also maybe be in a learning program but make progress by themselves or without the maybe the explicit presence of a teacher for them to be learning.
Exactly. So in a classroom setting where we have learners and typically a teacher, we have lots of, let's say, we have lots of systems and processes that are taking place at the same time. So obviously we have peers or classmates that are supporting through interaction. We have the teacher that is a source of knowledge, that is maybe a model for the type of knowledge that they are teaching. We also have access to materials, either in physical form or in a more digital format. So we have all these things in a normal classroom setting. And when we discuss learner autonomy and we focus on affordances, Obviously, learner autonomy tends to happen in an online environment. It's when we, at home from the comfort of maybe a cafe, it might just be, at a friend's house or any kind of environment that is not in a school or a university. We interact with technology and we try to make the most of it so we can actually learn and move forward. And so we do need to discuss affordances in this particular context. Affordances as they relate mainly to the technology that we use for learners, right? So we might be talking about a platform that is used to store materials, to store quizzes, to be a repository for any kind of information or knowledge. And from the point of view of affordances, it is important for the technology, the platform, to be to clearly signal or to clearly let the learner know what they can do to the extent, to the degree that they can do it, so they can actually take advantage of it independently without any help. And this obviously sounds very straightforward, and it is in a sense very straightforward. And I think nowadays, with all the online platforms that we have available, either for autonomous learning or for maybe even synchronous learning, like video conferencing platforms, yes, learners can benefit from them. They generally understand how the platforms work, but it is a matter of maximizing the interaction with the platform. And sometimes it might be that I'm going over content for a particular course, for example, by myself, and I cannot find specific bits of information, or I'm not sure how to complete a quiz, or I'm not sure how to submit maybe an essay or some kind of project work. And this is typically because the affordances of the technology, surely the technology does have, let's say, the ability for us to do all these things, to complete a quiz, to look at material, to submit a project, but it might not be very clear to us how to do it. So then that's why it's important for us, as maybe for instructional designers, for the people who actually work on the system and the process for a platform, to include also signifiers, right? So these are signs, let's think of them as signs, that tell us how to use the technology to the best of our advantage. So going back to the example of the glass door that allows us to enter into a building or to see inside, yes, we do need to have a handle on the door that essentially indicates to us how the door opens. Depending on how this handle is designed, we might think that we need to slide the door to the left or to the right. It might be that the door is actually activated by a sensor, so it just opens automatically. There's no handle on it. It might be that it just pushes inward or outward. And so the handle here is a signifier, is essentially a sign for us to know how to use the door and maximize the interaction we have with this object, right? So in learning, in autonomous learning, we also have to think of these signifiers as handles. How easy it is for me to understand how to submit something, how to look at something, how to find something. So that's why this is very important. And many a time, systems and platforms are designed by information technology engineers, by people who are very much focused on processes, and they understand how the processes works very well from a technological point of view. However, we do have to take into account the psychology of human beings, right? So again, if I see a handle on a glass door, my first instinct is going to be, as a human being, to pull on it. But this might not always be the case. Maybe the door doesn't open this way. So instructional designers, IT systems engineers who design platforms for learning need to take into account the fact that they need to include signifiers that make sense to us as human beings, where we don't need to spend time or get frustrated, because the more time we spend trying to find something, or the more frustrated we get, the more difficult it is for us to actually continue learning, right? So there's another concept here that's associated. It's called the affective filter. So the affective filter is, we can think of it as a wall that might stand in the way of us learning. So again, if technology is this affective filter, if technology is a wall that is insurmountable because it doesn't have the right signifiers on it, because it doesn't have any built-in affordances that are good for learning, then obviously this goes up. And my experience today trying to learn is obviously going to be just affected, but also my experience of learning in the future. So my affective filter is going to go up. And as a learner, I'm going to be maybe afraid of the technology. I'm going to feel flustered and frustrated every time I have to look for something. So that's why this is very important for autonomous learning. Building in affordances, ensuring that these affordances are sort of maximized by adding mapping, by adding signifiers, by adding pointers for people to know how to utilize them fully. So that's the first concept that I wanted to discuss, and I hope it's maybe clear to my audience.
Yeah, so it's basically in the student part, it's make the best out of these tools that you're given, but also when it's about developing these tools, if we're speaking about virtual education, is to make it as friendlier and think really of the user experience and the psychology part of it. So the students actually learn how to use it very easily and make the best out of this tool or platform.
Exactly. Yeah. You can think of it as the intersection of design and human psychology. It needs to be just right for autonomous learning to be maximized and to work efficiently.
Okay. So you also mentioned scaffolding. Does it have anything to do with these platforms too?
Yes, in many ways, yes. So I gave the example of scaffolding in the physical world where we support the erection of a building, right? So I come from Eastern Europe, where learning and teaching tends to be very teacher-centered. You typically have a person with more knowledge, with more expertise, who is at the front of a classroom, who is essentially imparting knowledge, or let's say talking to students, giving them information, right? So this concept we now know is a bit outdated and doesn't work very well in terms of, again, of human psychology. It's not very efficient for us to have a teacher-centered learning experience. So this is where scaffolding takes a very prominent place. A teacher that aims to be efficient, a teacher that aims to maximize the learning of their students inside and outside the classroom will build this type of scaffolding, right? Whether by adding resources, by building something from the bottom to the top, by adding different elements along the way. They might add maybe group activities, they might add different materials, different handouts, they might add different type of media technology, for example, for students to interact. And all of this, what it does, it supports the learner as they maybe embark on learning by themselves, right? So scaffolding is very important, and whenever we plan a learning experience, and again, this might be a learning experience where you do have a teacher or we have a tutor that accompanies the student, or it might be a very independent learning experience, we need to consider building into it this scaffolding. This is very important. So again, to take the example of a typical learning platform, and we have lots of platforms these days that learners can take advantage of by themselves, or as part of maybe stacked courses that will give them credit for university, or maybe they have embarked on a more formal learning program, maybe a master's degree at university online. So if these courses have scaffolding embedded into them, then we know that the learner is accompanied in a sense by the system, by processes, even in the absence of another human, whether this is a teacher or peers or classmates. So it is very important when we structure a course, for example, for online learning, for autonomous learning, for it to be structured with the scaffolding in mind. Do we have the basic building blocks in place? Do we have access to the main components? Will the learner understand how to go from something small to something bigger? Do they know what kind of quizzes and materials and handouts they have available or as resources on the platform to build a learning experience? So this is again very important, and this is again where we have to take into account human psychology and the very fact that we might have a lot of energy, we might be very motivated, we might have all the right circumstances and context to learn, but we are still more efficient at learning if we have scaffolding in place, if there's a structure around us that points us in a very, let's say, in a very certain, very specific direction. So in the world of performance, especially in a work context, we often use the acronym of SMART that has to do with anything that we aim to do being measurable, being time bound, being realistic. So we also have to make scaffolding that is integrated in a platform, in a learning experience. We have to make it smart. It has to be, again, very specific. It has to be measurable. It has to be achievable. It has to be realistic. It has to be time bound. If it has these properties, then we know that learning experience is leading to a very specific point. It's taking the learner to a very specific point. So that's the second most important concept in autonomous learning, having scaffolding available.
Having scaffolding available. Okay. And the third that you mentioned was metacognition, which I understand to be the self-evaluation maybe process when we're speaking about learning, or how else would you describe it?
Right. So yeah, metacognition is essentially our ability to think about our own thinking. It's the ability to reflect on processes that go inside our head that are associated with thinking, with emotion, with feelings, with the way we interact with reality. Right. So this is again another basic human psychology topic that has a lot of relevance in autonomous learning. Mainly, well, this happens for a number of reasons. Number one, we don't typically get any training in our formative years, with our families or in school, as to how, self-reflect or to self-assess or to self-evaluate. We're not typically taught how to do this. And in a formal learning setting, we typically don't have a questionnaire or a quiz that essentially asks us to reflect on our own thinking. This is just not there. So because of that, and because this is important to the way we assess our thinking, the way we improve, it is important to consider it for any kind of autonomous or self-learning. So that's one reason why this is important. Another reason has to do with the fact that many a time learning doesn't just happen, let's say, in an isolated, in a siloed environment. So it's not that I'm stuck in some kind of a learning room and I'm just there. There are lots of connections with different sort of aspects of life, with learning experience, with work experience, with the experience of our peers, right? Our examples, with experience that we might get from our mentors and so on. And the ability to self-reflect and to assess, also has to do with this. We must be able to read and understand how thinking works for other people as well, so we can take it and take the good examples and a good learning sort of out of it and apply it to our own learning. So metacognition essentially is about promoting and teaching self-reflection, self-monitoring during learning, self-evaluation. It has to do with our ability to set goals for our learning. And here I wanted to say that we have a lot of research available that shows us that when we have a course that someone is meant to embark on by themselves, and in terms of objectives for learning or for assessment, they are participants. That is, they work with a teacher, or the system or the platform gives them the opportunity to actually participate in the setting of objectives and goals. We know that this is related to metacognition happening in the right way, and with the ability of the person to self-reflect and to set goals for going forward. And it is more efficient when we are participants in our own goal setting for a course, right? It might be that learning has a pre-assessment component where we understand, learning abilities, sort of thinking skills, what sort of metacognition we have available to help us as we embark on the path of learning. So I think any kind of a system or platform or any sort of, let's say, environment that aims to support learners as they learn autonomously needs to include these components. The whatever it might be again, something that we read, a quiz. It might be sort of an interaction with our peers, with maybe mentors, with at the beginning, or that allows us to actually reflect on our own thinking, and that way we can become more efficient at learning. So And related to this, I think, again, research tells us that, community is important. And it's important for us to create a community of learners where if I'm uncomfortable, for example, interacting with a tutor because maybe I might feel that this person is very intimidating or doesn't have enough time for me, then I do have a community of learners like myself, my peers, my classmates, for example, where I can actually interact with them on a forum, where I can actually allow them to look at some of my work and review it, where I can actually review it myself, their work, and then actually go forward. So this is very important. I did mention the ability or the us needing to facilitate this negotiated sort of learning activities or goals or objectives. So we know that we are part of it, we're participants. Flexible access is also an important component that is, from a human psychology standpoint. Again, if I'm learning autonomously and I need to be able to reflect on my own learning, I also need to be able to access sort of different parts that connect to this. So how will I be able to evaluate this? What is the framework for it? What sort of questions do I need to ask myself? Do I keep a journal, of learning? Do I have regular meetings where the focus with my tutor or with peers is, again, focused on self-reflection, for example? And then something that also came up in these studies is that when we have support from facilitators, right, when we have support from, guidance counselors, when we have support from, teachers or mentors, obviously learning happens much faster. And in the context of autonomous learning, we also have to embed this in the learning experience. We have to find a way of including access to these mentors, these support people that will allow us, if the affordances, for example, are not fully there, they're not very efficient, or if the scaffolding is incomplete, and if metacognition is something new for us and we're not really self-reflecting the way we should, then it's important to also have a human being that is involved to a certain degree to support us, right? To support us as an expert and as a facilitator in our own learning sort of path.
Okay, so that was actually my next question, or the doubt that I had in mind, because in paper, learner autonomy seems great. The students are learning, they're motivated, they have the tools, you're making the best out of them. So my question is, what exactly would be now the role of a teacher or a educational institution when students get to be so autonomous in their learning?
Right, especially since usually in autonomous learning, for example, learning online, we don't have tutors or teachers available 24/7 or on a very regular, easy access basis. So how do we take this very important component to a self-learning experience? That is your question.
Exactly.
So, and then this can be done in a number of ways. I think nowadays, those courses that are very successful, that have high retention rates, obviously have a component from the very beginning that aims to, first of all, let a learner know how they can access different resources. They essentially make very clear the affordances that I have available. They also, this sort of first module in a course or this introductory session that you might have with someone else also gives you an idea of the support you have available, the scaffolding available in a given course or learning experience. And it might even give you an idea of how metacognition can play a role into your learning, into your subsequent learning, right? By explaining that at the end of each module, for example, there's a reflection paper that you have to submit, that you have to read, maybe send it to a peer, maybe send it to someone else, So many courses these days are designed to be completely independent and not rely on any synchronous learning, have this sort of initial component that puts the learner at ease, that lets the learner know that they have access to all these things and the course is well designed. And then, as I mentioned, if from the very beginning, whatever system we're using fosters access and a sense of access to a community of learners, then this is even more important. So in the very early stages of any course, it is important for the learners to know that there are other learners just like them available who have possibly the same questions and some of the answers, and they can actually interact with them, and they know how to interact with them, and they know it's a flexible way of being able to do this, on my own time, in my own space, at my own rhythm and pace, whichever way I can do it. So this is important, and many courses do have this incorporated. However, what we've seen is that generally for a course to be successful, especially university level, let's say an online course where we rely on a lot of autonomous learning to be successful, we need to make these tutors and these guides available throughout. So at any point, I should know that I can actually be able to go to someone, contact someone, schedule a session with someone who not necessarily their role is not to give me a lecture on a given topic or to teach me something, but just to allow me to facilitate and negotiate my learning experience. So this is also a very important component. And this is where we might have different platforms and online program managers, for example, that make this a core part of their offer. And they find systems that are very efficient, that allow these teachers or these mentors to interact with learners, and that facilitates learner autonomy outside the classroom. This is very important to be set up efficiently.
Okay. Well, we're running out of time, but I do have two final questions. The first one is, do you think this will be just a tendency, or is this the future of education? And the next question is there any takeaway that you would like to say to our community that's listening to us? Any final lesson or reflection?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think nowadays learning providers have understood that learner autonomy is an important component, and they need to give students flexibility and the tools that they can use themselves to actually continue learning. Partly because this is very efficient for any kind of learning provider. Obviously, when I do a lot of my learning, this is cost efficient for the learning provider on one hand. And on the other hand, when we look at trends around stackability, for example, this is exactly what learning providers are trying to do. So now they understand that flexibility is an important part for me as a learner, is an important component. So they allow me to essentially take the courses that I need when I need them, when I can actually do them, and then allow me to obtain certificates that are stackable, for example, and then that way I have maybe access to a more formal degree that I can obtain, and so on. So this is, again, learning providers seeing this tendency and understanding that learners are at the center of their own learning experience, and we need to be flexible and to provide affordances and provide the scaffolding needed. So I see this more and more. However, we do have, let's say, generally, we do have this traditionalist thinking, right, where we have the typical idea that for someone to learn efficiently, they need to be present in a fixed location somewhere, and to have access to a regular scheduled classroom with a teacher at the center, a teacher that guides the learning experience. And I think there's still some resistance there. But at the same time, as I said, I see very encouraging signals that a lot of universities and other learning providers actually understand they need to move away from this model and to a model that is more centered on the learner, and on the learner as the person that leads on their own learning experience. So I see this more and more. And there are some other issues that I think are very, let's say, salient to our own times. So, for example, a recent report from the IMF, I believe, came out and talked about how women, for example, in many emerging markets, don't have access to education. And for them, for example, being able to provide an online education where the autonomous and flexible component is present and very strong is the key to improve, again, their own lives as learners, as workers later on, as productive members of society, and to improve society overall. So I think there's also this, let's say, angle that is more humanistic, that is more focused on us as humans, is not about maximizing profit and making learning efficient from an economic standpoint, but rather enhancing learning and adding to the positive impact we have overall in society by investing properly and by creating opportunities for autonomous learners, right? And I think your second question was had to do with sort of advice or my own insight again that I would give maybe to universities or learning providers. And here the idea is, as I said at the beginning, a lot of these concepts that we discussed today are at the intersection of design and human psychology. Everyone would do well, any kind of a learning system, a learning provider would do well to actually consider that as, again, the intersection of design. So good design that works for us as human beings, that builds us better. And then that also takes into account our human psychology, right? Our idiosyncrasies, our ways of learning that are not going to change. So that would be my advice, to just, to maybe move away a little bit from, systems and a focus on engineering and making this work in a very logical sense, and get a bit closer to design and to human psychology the way we do in other fields, like in art and architecture, for example. That would be my advice for any kind of a learning provider in the future.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Lucian. It was very enlightening. I learned so much, and I'm sure people who are listening and seeing this have learned a lot too. So thank you so much, and we'll see you soon, I hope.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
So that's what we have for you today. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and share it on your social media so it reaches more people. Stay tuned for the next episode of Un Café con Scala, or A Coffee with Scala, brought to you by Scala Learning.